She said I wasn't marriage material because I was just a freelance consultant, while her coworker Raymond had a real career and stability. What she didn't know was that I was about to buy the entire company where both she and Raymond worked, and Raymond's days of mocking my supposed lack of success were numbered. I met Victoria Chen 4 months ago at a coffee shop near the University District in Austin. I'd been working late on acquisition documents when she struck up a conversation about the pharmaceutical journals spread across my table. She worked as a quality assurance coordinator at Meridian Biosystems, she told me, and was impressed that I seemed to understand regulatory compliance issues that most people found mind-numbing. When she asked about my work, I kept things deliberately vague, mentioning that I did freelance business consulting for pharmaceutical companies. The truth was infinitely more complicated and lucrative. I'm a pharmaceutical manufacturing acquisition specialist, essentially a corporate hunter who identifies vulnerable biotech companies and either acquires them myself or facilitates their purchase by larger corporations. But NDAs and the incredibly sensitive nature of deal-making meant I couldn't discuss any specifics about my actual work. My mentor, Dr. Harrison, had drilled this into me during my first year in the business. He'd built a fortune through discrete acquisitions and taught me that one careless comment about targeting a company could torpedo months of delicate negotiations and cost millions in lost opportunities. For 6 years, I'd been quietly identifying struggling biotech firms, conducting exhaustive analysis of their operations, financial vulnerabilities, and market positions. The work required understanding complex regulatory frameworks, analyzing financial statements, evaluating intellectual property portfolios, and assessing management competency. It wasn't glamorous work that impressed people at parties, but it was incredibly lucrative and intellectually challenging in ways that traditional corporate employment never could be. Victoria seemed genuinely charmed by my flexible schedule and apparent ability to work from anywhere. She'd text me during her lunch breaks, complaining about her rigid corporate environment with its pointless meetings and bureaucratic inefficiencies, while praising my freedom to set my own hours and choose my projects. I started falling for what I thought was her intelligence and genuine ambition. She spoke passionately about quality control standards and regulatory compliance, subjects that most people found tedious but that were central to my work. She seemed genuinely committed to excellence in her field, and her attention to detail matched my own analytical nature. Our first month together was exactly what I'd been looking for after years of focusing entirely on building my career and financial foundation. She was beautiful, driven, intellectually curious, and appreciated the quiet dinners and thoughtful conversations that my previous relationships had dismissed as boring. I thought I'd finally found someone who valued substance over superficial flash, someone who could appreciate depth and genuine achievement rather than just surface-level status symbols. The subtle comments started around week 6, innocent enough that I almost missed their significance. She mentioned how nice it must be to not have the pressure and stress of a real corporate job, how freelance consulting seemed so wonderfully unstable and flexible compared to her steady position with comprehensive benefits and clear advancement opportunities. When I picked her up from work events or company gatherings, she'd introduce me vaguely as someone who worked in business consulting, never with the enthusiasm or pride she reserved for discussing her colleagues' professional achievements and career trajectories. I started noticing that she particularly lit up when talking about Raymond Martinez, a senior QA manager who'd been with Meridian for 8 years and had worked his way up from entry-level technician. He drove a leased BMW, owned a downtown condo in an expensive building, and frequently organized elaborate team dinners that showcased his generous salary and expense account privileges. She'd describe his presentations to upper management with genuine admiration, detailing his sophisticated understanding of regulatory frameworks while subtly contrasting his obvious corporate success with my apparent lack of traditional career structure and advancement. The comparisons became more frequent and pointed as our relationship progressed into its 3rd month. Raymond understood complex regulatory requirements, she'd say with obvious respect, while implying through tone and context that my consulting work was somehow less substantial or intellectually demanding. He was actively climbing the corporate ladder with clear goals and measurable progress, while I seemed mysteriously content drifting between undefined projects without any apparent long-term strategy or ambition. She never directly criticized my work or questioned my professional competence, but her tone and body language increasingly suggested she viewed my career as a temporary phase rather than a legitimate long-term path. I found myself defending choices and decisions I'd never questioned before, explaining that independent consulting offered intellectual freedom and financial rewards that traditional corporate employment simply couldn't match. But the specifics that would have most impressed her were precisely what I couldn't reveal. The million-dollar deals, the strategic acquisitions, the substantial wealth I'd built through successful negotiations, all of it was locked behind ironclad confidentiality agreements that made me appear to be just another struggling freelancer trying to make ends meet. The irony was absolutely brutal and increasingly frustrating. Victoria clearly admired corporate success, traditional advancement, and financial stability, all qualities she believed Raymond possessed in abundance and that I apparently lacked entirely. What she couldn't possibly know was that while Raymond was busy impressing junior staff members with his expense account dinners and company car privileges, I was quietly building substantial wealth through highly successful acquisitions that dwarfed anything he could achieve in a traditional corporate role. My last major deal alone had generated more profit than Raymond would likely earn in his entire career at Meridian, but confidentiality restrictions meant I had to sit quietly while being judged as professionally inadequate by someone whose own workplace I was actively preparing to purchase. What Victoria and Raymond couldn't possibly know was that I'd been secretly negotiating to acquire Meridian Biosystems for 8 months before I even met her, and the deal was rapidly approaching its final stages with closing scheduled for the following week. I'd initially identified Meridian as a prime acquisition target during routine market analysis the previous spring when their quarterly reports revealed troubling financial patterns that most investors had overlooked or dismissed as temporary operational challenges. The company was hemorrhaging money despite appearing profitable on paper, and my preliminary investigation suggested serious underlying operational problems that made them extremely vulnerable to a strategic buyout from someone willing to implement immediate structural reforms. My due diligence process had been exhaustive, expensive, and deeply concerning from both legal and ethical perspectives. What started as standard financial analysis quickly revealed a company rotting from within due to systematic regulatory violations, falsified quality control reports, and a toxic workplace culture that consistently prioritized appearance over actual regulatory compliance. The deeper my forensic accounting team dug into their internal operations, the more disturbing and legally problematic the picture became. Internal audit documents obtained through legitimate discovery channels showed that Meridian had been systematically covering up contamination incidents for over 18 months, deliberately manipulating testing data to avoid FDA scrutiny, and routinely intimidating employees who attempted to raise legitimate safety concerns through proper corporate channels. The regulatory violations alone could have resulted in criminal charges and massive federal fines that would completely bankrupt the company if discovered by federal investigators or exposed through whistleblower complaints. At the center of this elaborate fraud was Raymond Martinez himself, the same man Victoria consistently admired for his corporate success, professional competence, and sophisticated understanding of regulatory frameworks. My forensic accounting team had traced a clear pattern of falsified compliance reports directly to his department, where fundamental quality control standards were routinely ignored whenever they conflicted with aggressive production deadlines or unrealistic cost reduction targets imposed by senior management. Raymond had been systematically covering up contamination incidents that should have triggered immediate facility shutdowns and mandatory FDA notifications under federal law. Instead, he'd been deliberately burying the evidence and manipulating testing protocols to hide dangerous safety violations that put both company employees and consumers at serious risk of harm. The scope and audacity of the misconduct was absolutely staggering when viewed comprehensively. Internal emails obtained during the legal discovery process revealed Raymond explicitly instructing subordinates to delete quality control records, falsify mandatory inspection reports, and systematically intimidate potential whistleblowers who attempted to report safety violations through established corporate compliance channels. He'd created a pervasive culture of fear and silence where employees clearly understood that reporting problems would result in immediate termination while actively covering them up led to promotions, salary increases, and performance bonuses. The man Victoria saw as a successful corporate leader and professional role model was actually running what amounted to a criminal enterprise that consistently prioritized short-term profits over public safety and mandatory regulatory compliance. My acquisition team had meticulously identified at least 17 separate incidents where Raymond's department had covered up serious contamination events that legally required immediate FDA notification under federal manufacturing regulations. In 3 particularly egregious cases, contaminated products had actually reached consumer markets before being quietly recalled without proper regulatory disclosure or public safety warnings. The potential liability exposure was enormous, potentially reaching hundreds of millions in federal fines, civil penalties, and criminal prosecution if federal prosecutors decided to pursue charges against the company leadership for willful regulatory violations. This systematic fraud was exactly why Meridian's stock price had remained mysteriously depressed despite apparently strong earnings reports and positive industry conditions. Sophisticated institutional investors and regulatory specialists had detected the operational irregularities through careful analysis and were quietly divesting their positions while the regulatory time bomb remained hidden from public view and government oversight. My acquisition strategy specifically relied on purchasing the company before federal investigators uncovered the full extent of the violations, allowing me to implement immediate compliance reforms and avoid the massive penalties that would otherwise completely destroy the company's market value. The irony of dating someone who worked at my target company while remaining completely unable to discuss the pending acquisition was professionally challenging but personally excruciating on multiple levels. Every time Victoria praised Raymond's competence and leadership abilities, I had to physically restrain myself from revealing that her workplace hero was actually a criminal who'd been systematically endangering public safety for personal career advancement. When she described his impressive presentations to upper management with obvious admiration, I knew she was unknowingly describing carefully orchestrated deception designed to hide serious regulatory violations from company executives who would face personal criminal liability if they knew the truth about their operations. Victoria's admiration for Raymond's corporate success became increasingly painful to witness as my investigation revealed the true foundation of his achievements and professional advancement. His rapid rise through the corporate hierarchy wasn't based on genuine competence, leadership ability, or legitimate professional accomplishments, but specifically on his willingness to systematically cover up safety violations that more ethically minded employees would have immediately reported to regulatory authorities. His generous salary and expense account privileges were essentially blood money earned through systematic fraud that deliberately put countless lives at risk for the sake of maintaining profit margins and production schedules. The expensive team dinners that Victoria found so impressive and professionally aspirational were funded by cost savings achieved through deliberately ignoring fundamental safety protocols that existed specifically to protect public health and employee welfare. I'd spent months meticulously documenting evidence that would ultimately lead to Raymond's immediate termination and likely criminal prosecution, but strict confidentiality agreements prevented me from warning Victoria that her professional role model was actually a dangerous fraud whose entire career was built on regulatory violations and systematic workplace intimidation. The acquisition timeline meant I had perhaps weeks before the deal officially finalized and Raymond's extensive criminal misconduct became a direct corporate liability that would require immediate termination and law enforcement notification. The breaking point came at Meridian's annual corporate awards banquet, a lavish affair held at the downtown Hilton that Victoria had been excitedly discussing for weeks as her chance to introduce me to her colleagues and showcase our relationship to her professional network. She'd bought a new dress specifically for the occasion and had been coaching me on which executives to impress and what topics would demonstrate my supposed business acumen to people who actually mattered in corporate circles. I'd agreed to attend despite knowing it would be professionally awkward, but I hadn't anticipated just how humiliating the evening would become when Raymond decided to make me his personal entertainment for the night. The event was everything Victoria had promised, an elaborate display of corporate excess with an open bar, multi-course dinner, and carefully orchestrated award presentations designed to reinforce company hierarchy and celebrate achievements that I now knew were built on systematic fraud. Victoria was in her element, networking enthusiastically and introducing me to various department heads as her boyfriend who worked in business consulting, always with a slight apologetic tone that suggested she was making the best of an unfortunate situation. I'd been prepared for some awkwardness given my secret knowledge about the company's impending acquisition, but I wasn't prepared for Raymond's sustained campaign of public humiliation that began almost immediately after we were seated at his table. Raymond had positioned himself as the table's unofficial master of ceremonies, regaling everyone with stories about his latest corporate victories while subtly probing into my background and professional credentials. When Victoria mentioned that I did freelance consulting work, his eyes lit up with predatory interest, and I realized I was about to become his evening's entertainment. He started with seemingly innocent questions about my client base and project scope, but quickly escalated to openly mocking my apparent lack of traditional corporate structure and career advancement. The humiliation began subtly with backhanded compliments about how nice it must be to work from home without real responsibilities or accountability, but rapidly evolved into direct mockery about my supposed professional inadequacy. Raymond suggested that someone with my obvious intelligence might want to consider applying for their upcoming janitorial positions, since they offered excellent benefits and job security that freelance work apparently couldn't provide. The entire table of executives and department heads erupted in laughter at this suggestion, including Victoria, who whispered urgently that I should just go with it and not make things awkward by defending myself or pushing back against the obvious disrespect. I endured 3 excruciating hours of escalating mockery about my supposed lack of real employment while internally knowing that the acquisition papers were being finalized at midnight and that Raymond's own employment would be terminated within days. The irony was absolutely brutal, sitting there listening to a man who would soon be unemployed and likely criminally prosecuted mock me for supposedly lacking professional stability and career prospects. Raymond even offered to teach me about how real business actually worked, suggesting that I might benefit tremendously from learning how successful people actually built careers and generated meaningful value in corporate environments. The other executives at the table joined in enthusiastically, sharing advice about entry-level positions I might consider and discussing whether someone with my apparent skill set might be suitable for administrative or support roles within their industry. Victoria sat beside me throughout this ordeal, occasionally squeezing my hand under the table but never once defending me or suggesting that perhaps her colleagues were being inappropriately disrespectful to her guest. Instead, she seemed genuinely embarrassed by my presence and increasingly concerned that my inability to hold my own in corporate conversation was reflecting poorly on her professional judgment and social standing within the company. The most painful moment came when Raymond raised his wine glass for a toast celebrating everyone at the table who had built real careers through hard work and corporate dedication, pointedly excluding me from the gesture while the entire group laughed at the obvious slight. I sat there holding my untouched wine glass, watching the man whose criminal misconduct I'd been documenting for months mock me for supposedly lacking the professional integrity and business acumen that he clearly possessed in abundance. The evening felt like an endurance test designed to measure exactly how much public humiliation I could tolerate without breaking character or revealing information that could destroy months of careful acquisition planning. By the time the awards ceremony concluded and people began leaving, I felt like I'd been psychologically beaten down by professionals who had no idea they were about to discover that their target for mockery was actually their new owner and ultimate authority over their continued employment. Raymond's final insult came as we were gathering our coats, when he handed me his business card and suggested that I should call him next week about potential opportunities, since he might be able to arrange an interview for an entry-level position that would provide the career stability that freelance consulting obviously couldn't offer someone with my limited professional prospects. He even offered to serve as a personal reference and mentor, explaining that successful business required learning from people who had actually achieved something meaningful in corporate environments rather than drifting aimlessly between undefined projects without clear advancement opportunities. The condescension was so thick I could practically taste it, but I accepted his card with appropriate gratitude and promised to consider his generous offer seriously. Victoria remained silent throughout this final exchange, clearly relieved that Raymond was offering to help her apparently unemployable boyfriend find legitimate work rather than continuing to mock him publicly. As we walked to my car after the banquet, She tried to smooth things over by explaining that Raymond was actually being helpful by offering career guidance, and that I should seriously consider taking him up on his mentorship offer since he obviously understood professional development in ways that my freelance experience hadn't taught me. She suggested that perhaps this evening had been a valuable learning experience that could help me understand what real corporate success actually looked like and how I might begin building the kind of career that would provide long-term security and advancement opportunities. The drive home was awkwardly quiet, with Victoria occasionally commenting on how impressive the other executives had been and how much she'd learned from their career advice and professional insights. She seemed particularly struck by Raymond's suggestion that successful people surrounded themselves with other successful people, and that perhaps I needed to consider whether my current professional circle was actually helping or hindering my career development. I knew she was essentially suggesting that I wasn't good enough for her professional aspirations, but I couldn't reveal that in less than 4 hours, the acquisition paperwork would be signed and Raymond's career would be effectively over while mine reached a new level of success that none of them could possibly imagine. The most frustrating part was knowing that Victoria genuinely believed she was being supportive by encouraging me to learn from Raymond's example, completely unaware that her professional role model was about to face criminal prosecution for systematic fraud. I spent the remaining drive home calculating exactly how I would handle Monday morning's introductions and whether Raymond's public humiliation of me would influence my decisions about his termination timeline and the specific charges I would recommend to federal prosecutors. The deal officially closed at exactly 11:43 p.m. that same night, making me the legal owner of Meridian Biosystems while Victoria slept peacefully beside me, completely oblivious to the massive change that would transform both our lives come Monday morning. I'd received the confirmation text from my legal team while she was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from sharing the news that would have answered every question she'd ever had about my professional competence and financial stability. The acquisition had been structured as a leveraged buyout with significant cash components, meaning I now owned every asset, employee contract, and liability associated with the company where Victoria worked, and Raymond had spent the evening mocking my supposed lack of business acumen. I spent the weekend reviewing termination procedures and regulatory compliance plans while Victoria texted me casually about weekend plans, shopping trips, and her excitement about introducing me to more of her colleagues who might be able to help my career development. She was particularly enthusiastic about arranging a lunch meeting with Raymond, suggesting that his offer to mentor me was exactly the kind of opportunity one needed to transition from freelance consulting into legitimate corporate employment. The irony of her career advice was almost too much to bear, but I maintained my cover story while internally preparing for Monday's revelations. My legal team had prepared a comprehensive presentation about new quality control standards, regulatory compliance protocols, and cultural changes that would be implemented immediately to address the systematic violations we discovered during due diligence. The forensic audit findings provided clear justification for immediate leadership changes, particularly in Raymond's department where the most egregious fraud had occurred. I'd also prepared my introductory speech as the new CEO, carefully balancing professional courtesy with the firm authority that would be necessary to implement sweeping reforms without triggering panic or mass resignations. The acquisition included detailed management restructuring plans that would eliminate Raymond's position entirely while promoting several junior employees who had been systematically suppressed under the previous regime. We'd identified multiple promising candidates for leadership roles, particularly among the staff members who had attempted to report safety violations through proper channels only to face retaliation and intimidation from Raymond's corrupt management structure. These employees would be immediately elevated to positions of authority while the executives responsible for creating the toxic workplace culture would be terminated for cause. I'd spent months developing relationships with key employees through discrete channels, ensuring that qualified replacements were ready to assume critical responsibilities when the inevitable management purge began. The weekend also involved finalizing arrangements with federal regulatory agencies who would be conducting immediate compliance audits to ensure that all safety violations were properly documented and remediated. The FDA had been quietly investigating Meridian for months based on whistleblower complaints, and my acquisition provided the perfect opportunity to cooperate fully with their investigation while avoiding the criminal liability that would have destroyed the previous ownership. Victoria remained completely unaware of these developments, sending me text messages about her weekend plans and asking whether I'd given any serious thought to Raymond's generous offer of career assistance. She seemed particularly hopeful that I might be ready to abandon freelance consulting in favor of traditional corporate employment that would provide the stability and advancement opportunities she clearly valued. I found myself responding to her messages with increasing amusement, knowing that Monday morning would provide answers to every concern she'd expressed about my professional prospects and long-term financial security. The most challenging part was maintaining my emotional equilibrium while she continued praising Raymond's leadership abilities and corporate success, completely unaware that her professional hero was about to face immediate termination and likely criminal prosecution for systematic fraud that had endangered countless lives. Sunday evening, Victoria called me excitedly to share her conversation with Raymond, who had apparently spent part of his weekend thinking about potential opportunities for me within the company structure. She relayed his suggestion that I should consider starting in their business development department as an entry-level analyst, where I could learn proper corporate procedures while contributing to legitimate business operations rather than continuing with my apparently unstable freelance arrangements. Raymond had emphasized that Meridian was a company that valued loyalty and long-term commitment, qualities that successful careers were built upon rather than the project-based uncertainty that characterized my current professional situation. Victoria was particularly impressed by his willingness to personally vouch for my potential despite my obvious lack of traditional corporate experience, suggesting that this kind of mentorship opportunity was exactly what I needed to build a foundation for real career advancement and financial security. She'd even scheduled a preliminary coffee meeting for Tuesday morning where Raymond could discuss specific opportunities and help me understand what transitioning to legitimate corporate employment would actually entail. I listened to her enthusiastic planning while reviewing termination documents that would make Tuesday's coffee meeting impossible due to Raymond's impending unemployment and potential criminal charges. The cognitive dissonance was extraordinary, hearing her describe elaborate career plans involving a man whose professional existence would effectively end within hours of my Monday morning arrival. I found myself genuinely curious about how she would process the revelation that her boyfriend was not only professionally successful but actually owned the entire company where she worked and had ultimate authority over every aspect of her professional environment. Victoria's excitement about potentially improving my career prospects through Raymond's intervention revealed how fundamentally she'd misunderstood both my actual professional position and the true nature of the man she'd chosen as my potential mentor and career guide. Her enthusiasm for these plans also highlighted how completely unprepared she was for Monday's transformation of our entire relationship dynamic, when her supposedly unemployable boyfriend would be revealed as her ultimate boss with complete authority over her continued employment and professional advancement. The weekend concluded with me finalizing my transition plan for assuming operational control of a company whose employees had spent Friday evening mocking my apparent professional inadequacy, completely unaware that their target for ridicule now held their careers in his hands and would be making immediate decisions about their continued employment based partly on their Friday night behavior and attitude toward professional courtesy and respect. Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m., I was formally introduced to the entire company as their new owner and chief executive officer during an emergency all-hands meeting that had been scheduled over the weekend without any advance explanation to the staff. The conference room was packed with confused employees who had been summoned from their Monday morning routines for what management had described only as an important company-wide announcement regarding organizational changes and new leadership structure. I'd arrived early to coordinate with my transition team and review the presentation materials one final time, ensuring that every aspect of my introduction would convey both professional competence and decisive authority while maintaining appropriate respect for employees who had played no role in the systematic fraud that necessitated this dramatic change in ownership and management. Victoria was seated near the front with her quality assurance colleagues, checking her phone and whispering about the mysterious nature of the meeting, completely unaware that her boyfriend was about to walk into the room as her new ultimate boss and the person with complete authority over every aspect of her professional future. Raymond had positioned himself prominently among the senior management group, displaying the confident bearing of someone who believed his position was secure and his professional reputation was unassailable, completely oblivious to the fact that he was about to face immediate termination for criminal misconduct. The moment I entered the conference room and walked to the front podium, the atmosphere shifted dramatically as recognition dawned on faces throughout the audience. Raymond's expression went through a fascinating progression from confusion to recognition to absolute shock as he realized that the man he had spent Friday evening publicly humiliating as a basement consultant was now standing before him as his new employer with complete authority over his continued employment. His coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room as everyone processed the implications of what they were witnessing. Victoria's face went completely pale as she stared at me in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing silently as she struggled to reconcile the boyfriend she thought she knew with the corporate executive now commanding the attention of her entire workplace. I could see her mind racing as she tried to understand how the supposedly unemployable freelance consultant she had been dating for 4 months was suddenly revealed as someone with the financial resources and business acumen to acquire her entire company. The shock on her face was particularly painful to witness because it revealed how fundamentally she had misunderstood not only my professional capabilities but my actual identity and life circumstances. I delivered my prepared presentation with calm professionalism, outlining new quality control standards, regulatory compliance protocols, and cultural changes that would be implemented immediately to address the systematic problems that had necessitated this ownership transition. The speech emphasized that Meridian would now operate with complete integrity and respect for all employees regardless of their background, position, or tenure, sending a clear message that the previous culture of intimidation and hierarchy would be eliminated entirely under the new management structure. I explained that comprehensive audits would begin immediately in all departments to ensure full regulatory compliance and that employees should expect significant changes in leadership, procedures, and accountability standards as we worked to rebuild the company's reputation and operational integrity. Throughout my presentation, I maintained eye contact with various employees while carefully observing Raymond's increasingly desperate expression as he began to comprehend the full scope of his professional predicament. The man who had offered to teach me about real business over the weekend was now realizing that he was about to receive a very different kind of education about accountability and consequences for systematic misconduct. I concluded by announcing that individual meetings would be scheduled throughout the week to discuss role changes, performance expectations, and opportunities for advancement under the new organizational structure, emphasizing that this transition represented an opportunity for qualified employees to assume greater responsibilities while those who had engaged in unethical practices would face immediate termination. The presentation lasted exactly 37 minutes and concluded with a question-and-answer session where stunned employees struggled to process the reality that their Friday night entertainment had become their Monday morning boss with complete authority over their professional futures and continued employment at a company he now owned entirely. The first question came from a junior technician who nervously asked about job security under the new ownership, and I assured him that qualified employees who had maintained ethical standards would have expanded opportunities for advancement and professional development. The second question was more pointed, coming from a department head who had witnessed Friday's humiliation and wanted to know whether personal relationships would influence business decisions under my leadership. I addressed this directly by explaining that all employment decisions would be based strictly on professional competence, regulatory compliance, and ethical conduct, regardless of any personal history or social dynamics that might exist between myself and individual employees. This response sent a clear message to everyone who had participated in or witnessed Raymond's public mockery that their behavior would be evaluated through a professional lens rather than personal vendetta, though I made it equally clear that respect and professional courtesy were fundamental requirements for continued employment. Raymond himself remained completely silent throughout the question period, his face growing progressively more ashen as he began to fully comprehend the magnitude of his professional miscalculation and the inevitable consequences of his systematic misconduct. I could see him frantically calculating whether his Friday night behavior alone would be sufficient grounds for termination, completely unaware that his criminal fraud had already sealed his fate regardless of any personal considerations. Victoria also remained silent, though I noticed her hands trembling as she gripped her notepad and struggled to maintain professional composure while processing the revelation that everything she thought she knew about her boyfriend's career and financial situation had been completely wrong. The meeting concluded with my announcement that individual performance reviews would begin immediately and that all employees should prepare documentation of their recent work, accomplishments, and any concerns about operational procedures or workplace culture that they wished to address confidentially. I emphasized that this transition period represented an opportunity for honest communication about problems that may have been previously suppressed or ignored, and that employees would be protected from retaliation for reporting legitimate concerns about safety, compliance, or management misconduct. As employees filed out of the conference room, I observed their reactions carefully, noting which individuals seemed genuinely relieved by the promise of cultural change versus those who appeared concerned about increased scrutiny of their professional conduct. Raymond lingered near his seat, apparently hoping for a private conversation, but I deliberately avoided eye contact and instead engaged with several junior employees who approached to express appreciation for the emphasis on respect and ethical conduct. Victoria remained in her seat long after others had departed, staring at me with a complex mixture of shock, confusion, and what appeared to be dawning recognition that her perception of our relationship's power dynamic had been completely inverted. When the room finally emptied except for my transition team, she approached hesitantly with an expression that suggested she was struggling to reconcile the confident executive she had just witnessed with the supposedly struggling freelancer she thought she had been dating. I could see her mind working to reframe every conversation we'd had about career stability and professional advancement in light of the revelation that I had been successful beyond anything she had imagined while she was encouraging me to learn from Raymond's example of corporate achievement and traditional career development. I terminated Raymond's employment within 48 hours of the acquisition announcement, after my legal team completed their final review of the forensic audit that revealed the full scope of his systematic regulatory fraud and criminal misconduct. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, documenting years of falsified quality control documents, deliberate contamination cover-ups, and systematic intimidation of employees who attempted to report safety violations through proper channels. Raymond's termination meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. During which I presented him with a comprehensive summary of the violations that justified immediate dismissal for cause, effectively eliminating any possibility of severance pay, unemployment benefits, or positive employment references that might help him find work elsewhere in the pharmaceutical industry. His face went through the same progression of emotions I'd witnessed Monday morning, but this time the shock was accompanied by genuine terror as he realized that his criminal conduct had been thoroughly documented and that federal prosecutors would likely pursue charges that could result in substantial prison time and personal financial ruin. I made it clear that his termination was based entirely on professional misconduct and regulatory violations, not personal animosity related to Friday night's humiliation, though I privately acknowledged that his public mockery had certainly influenced my decision to expedite the termination timeline rather than allowing him additional time to potentially destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses. When Victoria confronted me privately later that day about Raymond's sudden dismissal, demanding to know why I hadn't revealed my true identity and asking whether I was firing people out of personal revenge, I calmly explained that she had chosen to participate in my public humiliation rather than defend her own boyfriend when he was being disrespected by her colleagues. The conversation revealed the fundamental problem with our relationship dynamic, which was that she had consistently prioritized her professional image and workplace social standing over loyalty and basic respect for someone she claimed to care about. I pointed out that when her colleagues were mocking me, she had whispered for me to just go with it instead of suggesting that perhaps they were being inappropriately disrespectful to her guest, demonstrating that her primary concern was avoiding workplace awkwardness rather than supporting her partner. Her response was to argue that I should have told her about my real job, but I reminded her that my supposed lack of professional success had clearly influenced her assessment of my value as a romantic partner, as evidenced by her increasingly obvious admiration for Raymond's traditional corporate achievements and her persistent suggestions that I needed career guidance from someone who had actually accomplished something meaningful. The relationship deteriorated rapidly as Victoria struggled with the complete inversion of power dynamics and her growing realization that she had systematically undervalued and disrespected someone whose professional success dwarfed anything she had previously encountered in her limited corporate experience. I placed her on a mandatory 90-day performance improvement plan after discovering that her own quality control reports contained significant errors, missed deadlines, and procedural violations that suggested either incompetence or deliberate negligence in her fundamental job responsibilities. The performance plan was based entirely on legitimate professional deficiencies that had been overlooked under Raymond's corrupt management, but Victoria interpreted it as personal retaliation for her participation in Friday night's mockery and her subsequent failure to support me during what she now understood had been a deliberately humiliating attack on someone who was actually her professional superior. Two other senior managers who had participated enthusiastically in Raymond's mockery were terminated within the week for various compliance violations, including falsified expense reports, inappropriate use of company resources, and failure to maintain required certifications for their regulatory responsibilities. These terminations were based on legitimate professional misconduct discovered during the comprehensive audit, but the timing sent a clear message to remaining employees that disrespect and unprofessional behavior would no longer be tolerated under the new management structure. The cultural transformation was immediate and dramatic, as employees who had been suppressed under Raymond's intimidation-based leadership suddenly felt empowered to report problems, suggest improvements, and contribute to genuine regulatory compliance efforts. Several junior employees who had been passed over for promotion due to their refusal to participate in the systematic fraud were immediately elevated to leadership positions, creating a new management team based on competence and ethical conduct rather than willingness to cover up safety violations. Within 2 weeks, the company's operational atmosphere had completely transformed from fear-based hierarchy to collaborative excellence, with former subordinates now thriving in roles where their integrity and professional competence were valued rather than suppressed. The most satisfying aspect of this transformation was watching genuinely qualified employees assume responsibilities that had been monopolized by the corrupt management structure, demonstrating that the company's problems had been leadership-based rather than systemic incompetence among the broader workforce. Victoria's failure to meet the basic requirements of her performance improvement plan became increasingly obvious as she struggled with tasks that should have been routine for someone with her supposed experience and qualifications, revealing that her previous success had been largely dependent on Raymond's willingness to overlook deficiencies and cover for her mistakes rather than genuine professional competence. The performance improvement plan required her to complete standard quality assurance protocols without errors, meet established deadlines for regulatory submissions, and demonstrate competency in basic compliance procedures that were fundamental to her job description. Her inability to consistently execute these basic responsibilities suggested that she had been coasting on Raymond's protection rather than developing genuine expertise in her field, which explained why she had been so impressed by his apparent competence while remaining unaware that his entire department was systematically violating the regulations she was supposed to understand and enforce. As the 90-day period progressed, it became increasingly clear that Victoria's professional confidence had been largely illusory, built on a foundation of reduced expectations and overlooked mistakes rather than actual achievement and competency. Her growing frustration with the performance standards led to increasingly frequent arguments about fairness and proportionality, during which she accused me of imposing requirements that were unrealistic and punitive rather than acknowledging that these standards were actually basic expectations for someone in her position. The most revealing moment came when she demanded to know why she was being held to higher standards than she had been under Raymond's management, apparently unaware that Raymond's management had been criminally negligent and that normal professional standards should not be considered unusually demanding for someone with her experience and salary level. Victoria's deteriorating performance coincided with her growing resentment about our personal relationship, which she felt had been fundamentally dishonest due to my failure to reveal my true professional status and financial resources. She argued that my secrecy about the acquisition had prevented her from making informed decisions about our relationship's future, but I pointed out that her obvious loss of respect for my supposed lack of career success had already revealed her true priorities and values regarding romantic partnerships. The relationship became increasingly strained as she struggled to reconcile her previous condescension with the new reality of our professional hierarchy, creating an uncomfortable dynamic where she was simultaneously my girlfriend and my underperforming employee facing potential termination. Her attempts to separate our personal and professional interactions were undermined by her inability to maintain basic job performance standards and her persistent belief that our romantic relationship should somehow exempt her from the normal consequences of professional inadequacy. The situation became untenable when she began spreading rumors among her colleagues that I was deliberately sabotaging her career out of personal vindictiveness, despite the fact that her performance deficiencies were thoroughly documented and based on objective professional standards rather than subjective evaluation or personal bias. Her failure to take responsibility for her own professional shortcomings while simultaneously expecting special treatment due to our personal relationship demonstrated a fundamental lack of integrity that made it impossible to maintain either a romantic partnership or a functional professional relationship. The final straw came when she attempted to leverage our personal relationship to negotiate more favorable performance standards, suggesting that a supportive boyfriend would be more understanding about the challenges she was facing rather than holding her accountable to the same standards as other employees who didn't have personal connections to management. 6 months after the acquisition, Meridian Biosystems achieved full FDA compliance for the first time in over 3 years and increased operational efficiency by 22% under my comprehensive restructuring and cultural transformation initiatives. The regulatory improvements were particularly significant given the company's previous history of systematic violations, and the efficiency gains demonstrated that ethical management practices actually enhanced rather than hindered profitable operations. Victoria failed her performance improvement plan spectacularly and was terminated for continued quality control errors, persistent failure to meet basic job requirements, and her inability to adapt to professional standards that should have been routine for someone with her supposed experience and qualifications. Her termination was based entirely on documented performance deficiencies and had nothing to do with our failed personal relationship, though she immediately began spreading rumors throughout the industry that I had fired her out of personal revenge rather than legitimate professional inadequacy. The irony was that her accusations of vindictive behavior actually damaged her own professional reputation more than mine, since anyone familiar with standard corporate procedures could review her performance documentation and see that her termination had been justified by objective professional failures rather than personal animosity or relationship drama. Her attempts to portray herself as a victim of workplace retaliation were undermined by the fact that several other employees had also been terminated during the same period for similar performance issues, and her inability to take responsibility for her own professional shortcomings became apparent to potential employers who conducted thorough background checks before making hiring decisions. Meanwhile, I had begun dating Hannah Rodriguez, a regulatory affairs consultant I met at an industry conference focused on pharmaceutical compliance and quality control standards. Hannah was everything that Victoria had pretended to be but wasn't: genuinely intelligent about regulatory frameworks, professionally accomplished through her own merit, and completely honest about her career goals and personal values from our very first conversation. The contrast between dating someone who appreciated competence and integrity versus someone who had been attracted primarily to perceived status and corporate hierarchy was immediately obvious and refreshing. Hannah was impressed by my commitment to ethical business practices and regulatory compliance, viewing these qualities as evidence of genuine professional competence rather than boring adherence to unnecessary bureaucratic requirements. Our relationship developed naturally based on mutual respect, shared professional interests, and compatible values regarding business ethics and personal integrity, creating a foundation that was completely different from the superficial attraction and status-focused dynamic that had characterized my relationship with Victoria. The company culture transformation was even more dramatic than the operational improvements, evolving from a fear-based hierarchy where employees were afraid to report problems into a collaborative environment where innovation and integrity were actively encouraged and rewarded. Former junior employees who had been systematically suppressed under Raymond's corrupt management were now thriving in leadership roles, bringing fresh perspectives and genuine expertise to departments that had been stagnant under the previous regime. The company received several industry recognition awards for quality improvements and workplace culture, acknowledgments that would have been impossible under the previous management structure that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability and regulatory compliance. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in job security, professional development opportunities, and confidence in management integrity, metrics that translated directly into reduced turnover, increased productivity, and enhanced reputation within the pharmaceutical industry. The most satisfying aspect of these changes was watching genuinely qualified employees assume responsibilities and authority that had been monopolized by the corrupt old guard, demonstrating that the company's previous problems had been entirely due to leadership failures rather than systemic incompetence among the broader workforce. Hannah often commented on how different my approach to business leadership was compared to other executives she had worked with, particularly my emphasis on promoting based on merit and ethical conduct rather than political connections or willingness to overlook problems for short-term convenience. 6 months after Victoria's termination, I learned through industry contacts that she was still unemployed and struggling to find work in pharmaceutical quality assurance, apparently because her references were problematic and her professional reputation had been damaged by the circumstances surrounding her departure from Meridian. Her attempts to find comparable positions were further complicated by the fact that Raymond, who might have served as a positive reference, was facing criminal charges related to his regulatory fraud and was therefore unable to provide credible endorsements for former colleagues without drawing attention to his own misconduct and legal problems. The pharmaceutical industry's emphasis on regulatory compliance and professional integrity meant that Victoria's association with a corrupt quality assurance department was a significant liability that potential employers were reluctant to overlook, regardless of whether she had been personally involved in the systematic violations or simply negligent in failing to detect and report them. Hannah and I had become engaged after dating for 8 months. A relationship that progressed naturally based on genuine compatibility rather than superficial attraction or status considerations. When I proposed, I was completely honest about my professional background, financial situation, and the circumstances that had led to the Meridian acquisition, sharing details that I had been unable to reveal to Victoria due to confidentiality restrictions. Hannah's response was to express admiration for my discretion and professionalism in handling sensitive business information, viewing my previous secrecy as evidence of integrity rather than deception or dishonesty about my true identity and circumstances. Our engagement was announced in industry publications as a partnership between 2 respected professionals who shared common values regarding business ethics and regulatory compliance, a stark contrast to the drama and controversy that had surrounded my relationship with Victoria and its aftermath. The wedding planning process was collaborative and enjoyable, reflecting our shared commitment to building something meaningful together rather than simply acquiring status symbols or social recognition through public displays of wealth and success. Hannah's family and professional colleagues were genuinely impressed by her choice of partner, viewing our relationship as a natural match between compatible professionals rather than an opportunistic arrangement based on financial advantage or social climbing aspirations. The contrast with Victoria's social circle, who had viewed me with barely concealed condescension, was immediately apparent and reinforced my understanding of how fundamentally different these relationships had been. A year after the acquisition, Meridian had become a model for ethical pharmaceutical manufacturing, with regulatory agencies citing the company as an example of how proper leadership could transform a problematic organization into an industry leader. The transformation required significant investment in new systems and personnel, but the results demonstrated that ethical business practices were ultimately more profitable than the previous management's approach. Former employees who had left during Raymond's tenure began reaching out about opportunities to return, having heard about the positive changes and improved workplace culture.